Welcome to what I believe is the third session on water as heritage. My name is Lucrezia Gigante. I'll be chairing the session and guiding you through our discussion. I'm a research associate at the University of Glasgow, working on the HRC place-based research program, looking at arts and humanities approaches to place-based work, practice, and policymaking. But since 2019, I've also been working with the global network of water museums, and that's why I'm really excited to be here today and be listening to these presentations. So we will hear from 3 speakers. Each presentation will be 15 minutes long, and there will be some time for questions at the end. So please use the chat if you want to add in comments and questions as we go. And then we'll come back to you after the presentations. I'll introduce now our first speaker. I'm really pleased that Jocelyn is joining us. Jocelyn Stevenson has worked in children's media for over 40 years as a writer, creator, showrunner, producer, and executive producer. Her work is informed by the conviction that content responsibly created for children can be a powerful influence that simultaneously educates, entertains, and inspires this important audience. Her credits include Sesame Street, Fraggle Rock, Jim Henson's Animal Show with Stinky and Jake, Ghost of Fafner Hall, Secret Life of Toys, Tale of Bunny Picnic, Mopatop's Shop, Bob the Builder, Thomas and Friends, Barney and Friends, The Magic School Bus Rides Again, and Fraggle Frog, Back to the Rock. An incredible list of work there, Jocelyn. In 2015, Jocelyn was awarded the BAFTA Children's Awards Special Award for contribution to children's media. Her current project, The Water Rubus, is a duology, and you'll tell me if I'm pronouncing that correctly, is a duology of novels for 9 to 12-year-olds that combines watertight science with an adventure-soaked story to saturate the imaginations of children around the world, to inspire them to love and protect our planet's water, the amazing substance that connects us all. It's the story of Earth from water's point of view. The Water Rubus Book 1 is now available on Amazon, and the Water Rubus Book 2 is on its way. So please join me in giving Jocelyn a virtual round of applause. You can use the reaction feature if you like. Her presentation is titled Earth from Water's Point of View, Bringing Water to Life for Children. Over to you, Jocelyn, when you're ready.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen and assume that this will work as it did before. Hang on. Okay, everything okay?
Perfect. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm starting this with a teeny little sort of film we made to introduce the book, and so I thought that would be a useful way to start. So here we go. So this is where we're going in this presentation, but I sort of wanted to tell you guys how I got there. At Stanford as an undergrad, going back in the late 60s, I was wandering around the campus all fired up about changing the world when I had an epiphany. It was almost like a voice in my head that said, if you want to change the world, start with children. So right then and there, I decided not to head towards pre-med, which was my original plan, but to delve into psychology instead, with an emphasis on child psychology. And in those days, the Stanford Psych Department was a very interesting place to be. So after graduating with a BA in psychology, I got a job as a founding teacher in a daycare center, where the approach was all about child-directed education. I absolutely loved it and learned so much from the children. But it was in that school that I saw Sesame Street for the first time. It was the end of the day, and I was the only teacher left with a few children whose parents were still coming to pick them up. I had to sweep up, and so I turned on the TV for the kids, something we rarely did in those days, and it was Sesame Street. I'd never seen it. I was mesmerized. Needless to say, not much sweeping up happened. And I just thought, they're doing for 9 million kids what we're trying to do for 30. Get me to New York. So I went to New York City, got an interview at the Children's Television Workshop, the organization that produced Sesame Street and the Electric Company, with the woman who headed up the magazine publishing. She hired me as an assistant, and that was it. A door opened. I eventually became the editor of the Sesame Street magazine, which is what you're seeing on the screen now, a print version of the show. So we followed the kind of research they did on the TV series. We tested everything that went into the magazine on our audience. They were all pre readers. So I learned a lot about print literacy. And you can't assume that when a kid sees a yellow circle in the sky that they're going to think it's the sun. They could think it's a big yellow ball. My favorite kid research story was we showed a little boy who lived in the city, New York City. We showed him a picture of a buffalo out on the plains of the United States of America. Where do buffaloes live? We asked him. Brooklyn, he said, which is because he lived in the city, Brooklyn was the only place where he'd seen wide open space. So I remember having my mind blown, though, when I watched a child study a 2-page spread with objects on it. Okay. And then she saw a picture of Count Von Count up in the corner. Didn't say anything to her. She immediately started to count the objects on the page. And I just thought, there's so much information is conveyed with this one picture. And that was when I started to appreciate the power of a beloved character. So I met Jim Henson because it was my job to take him the mechanicals for the magazine covered in tracing paper so he could approve. He could approve himself, and if necessary, blue line any illustration of a Muppet. Quality control is quality control in those days off the charts. In those days, I saw him fairly regularly, if not in his office, and performing Kermit or Ernie on Sesame Street set. When I married a Scot and said I would be leaving Sesame Street to move to the UK, it was just at the time that the Muppets were filming The Muppet Show in London. Jim asked me to join the UK-based company to work on Muppet publishing, and another door opened. So when The Muppet Show became a global success, Jim gathered a group of us together to start developing an international children's show. This children's series that eventually became Fraggle Rock. His initial directive to us was, I want you guys to create a show that will help for children, that will help stop war. And I remember one person in the room said, do you want that by next Thursday, Jim? And and to me, that was a huge lesson in the power of the big idea. So when Fraggle Rock finished production, I was asked by Scholastic Productions in New York City to help them turn the popular comic, The Magic School Bus, into a television series. Interestingly, the first comic that they'd published was The Magic School Bus at the Waterworks. So water's coming back into the presentation here. And The Magic School Bus story is about an inspired and enthusiastic teacher, Miss Frizzle, who has a magic bus that allows her students to experience the science. We're studying ants, the bus shrinks and takes them into an ant's nest. The solar system, forget the planetarium. The Magic School Bus blasts off into space. The digestive system, inside Arnold they go. The stories, rather than telling a story, the writing team working with our science advisors, we developed a way to make the science drive the stories rather than telling a story and laying the science on top. Each episode was built around a big science idea. Again, this big idea. A major insight for me occurred when I was assigned the water cycle episode, loosely based on that first comic. One of our rules for TV writers was that a big idea could not be an is, i.e., water is 2 parts hydrogen, 1 part oxygen, or this is the water cycle. The science had to be active. But to me at that point, the water cycle was an is, possibly because that's how it was presented to us in school. When I was looking for inspiration, how are we going to make this dramatic? What are we going to do with this episode? I saw an issue of National Geographic that was devoted to water, and one sentence leaped out. Water never stops moving. Eureka, that was it. The Magic School Bus kids would get stuck in the evaporate, condense, rain, repeat water cycle. And they would use a water treatment plant to get back to school. This was how we used the power of character-driven adventure to facilitate learning. It was experience over information. So fast forward to about 10 years ago, as I began my third act, I was inspired to gather my years of expertise and context to focus on the big idea of water, having been so fascinated by it when I did the Magic School Bus episode. It was clear from my years as a writer, producer, creator, that when children love characters created for them, those characters and their stories can have a major influence on a child's thinking, behavior, and worldview. Again, if you want to change the world, start with children. So my goal was to discover a story world and characters that would galvanize kids to love water so much that when they grew up in a world challenged by an evolving hydrosphere, they would respond with understanding, love, and respect, rather than misapprehension, fear, and greed. Could we create stories that would ultimately inspire the children growing up on them to work with water rather than try to manage and control it? So I started to research water. I don't need to tell any of you here that that's a huge subject. I read and I read and I read. I attended lectures both in person and online. And from my experience on the Magic School Bus, I knew I needed to know enough to be able to play with the story and the fantasy without misinforming the audience. So after a few years of exploration, I went to yet another panel presentation at the Royal Geographical Society here in London on water. And whoa, I understood what they were talking about. For the first time, I understood everything everybody was saying. I was even familiar with some of the people on the panel. So I felt at last it was time to formulate what I called my manifesto, the big ideas that would underpin my thinking. And here we go. Water is the most amazing substance in the universe. Water never stops moving. Every living thing on the planet has a relationship to water. Water connects us all. Now, the audience. Children are naturally creative and imaginative. If you want them to understand something, help them, not only children, anybody, help them experience it. If children feel an emotional connection to characters, then the stories have a lasting positive impact. And my favorite and most important, humor is essential. It has to be goofiness in the service of truth. And one of my favorite memories of Jim Henson was we'd been recording a show, and he was looking at the monitor to watch the playback. He was staring at it, sort of nodding, and he finally said, "That's so goofy, it's worthy of us." I love that. Inspiring. So I was now ready to find my story world and characters, and that's when I discovered the water rubas. There are 81 of them, and they arrived on the planet 4 billion years ago on the same asteroid. Water ruba is 99% water and 1% ruba. Water rubas, very importantly, are not creatures who live in water. They are water. If you look at a glass of, suddenly one could appear out of the water and then disappear back into it. That's really important. But it's that 1% ruba, which is a kind of light energy that causes each water ruba to glow a specific color that allows them to take shape and to talk and to make a sound they call the water ruba tuba. To help kids relate to the water rubas and to help them imagine what it would be like to be water, to meet a water ruba, I wanted to make it believable that a human child could turn into water. I'm going to read a little excerpts out of the book. At the beginning of the story, we meet Miriam, our 11-year-old human heroine, who's in a rush to get to the first day of science camp. She needs something for science show and tell, but what? Okay. "I've got an idea," said Grammy, pulling a jar of rice and bags of lentils from one of the many cupboards that lined the room, until, ta-da, she whirled around with a big rock housed in a glass display case. "Take this." "Your grandpa's asteroid?" said Miriam. "Wait, is that thing glowing, or is it my imagination?" "Why not? It's not doing anyone any good just sitting in the back of that cupboard. I'm sure Grandpa George would want you to have it. He gave it to me when I was 11, and now I'm giving it to you when you're 11. The thing is, Miriam needed to put this rock in her backpack, but it was not going to fit. "Arr!" howled Miriam. Beyond frustrated, she shoved the display case as hard as she could. "Go in!" That's when it slipped from her hands. "No!" She watched as the glass case with the rock inside headed towards the floor almost in slow motion, then hit it and smashed into pieces. "Oh no, Grammy, I'm so sorry. Glass everywhere. What have I done?" Miriam quickly reached down to grab the asteroid. The second she touched it, boom, flash, zzzt. Miriam's entire body vibrated for a moment, and her hair stood on end. "Is that rock giving me a shock?" Then the shaking stopped, and bit by bit her skin seemed to dissolve. "What's happening? Where's my skin going? Help!" Her muscles softened, her bones liquefied. "I can't feel my feet. Where have my legs gone? I can't stand up. Everything feels all mushy. Am I melting?" And then, with a sploosh, Miriam cascaded into a puddle on the floor. She had turned into water. This turning into water is called puddling, obviously. And when she turns back into a girl, it's called unpuddling. And Miriam's puddling and unpuddling is the beginning of a wild adventure. Miriam also discovers that she's able to travel as water at speed using water routes to anywhere on the planet where there is a water ruba. This superpower is called puddle jumping. And through Miriam, readers will experience Earth from water's point of view. There are good guys, there are bad guys, some really bad guys, people trying to control all the water on the planet, that kind of thing. And there are water rubas. Unlike the humans in the story, the water rubas have no agency, no preferences, no aversions. They're water. Water never wants anything to be different than it is. Does it care if it's polluted? Why would it? It's the universal solvent. Consequently, the water rubas are always joyful, always content, always moving, and they're funny. It's goofiness in the service of truth. Writing characters that are water was challenging, but even more challenging was designing them. I am not an artist, but my great friend Brian Froud is. Brian designed the films The Dark Crystal and Labyrinth and has published beautiful books on fairies and goblins and trolls. Brian not only understood that water rubas are water, but being the genius that he is, he was able to bring them into our world. So book 1 is out there, and I'm in the middle of my revisions, painstaking revisions on book 2, and the 2 books will complete the story. And I can't tell you how much I appreciate having the opportunity to talk to all of you in this forum about this project. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jocelyn. That was so brilliant. Can we give Jocelyn a round of applause again? Thank you so much. Now, yeah, and we'll come back to you for questions at the end. I'll go now to our second speaker, Daniela Spina. Daniela is a junior researcher at the Center for the Humanities at Nova University of Lisbon, where she carries out the project Narrating the Young, a comparative study on representation and self-representation of colonial youth in South Asia and East Africa, from colonial press to post-colonial fiction, 1930-1970. From 2021 to 2023, she worked as a lecturer in textual and comparative studies at the Università di Verona in Italy, and also at this time she was a member of the FCT-funded project Port Asia, Writing Asia in Portuguese, mapping literary and intellectual archives in Lisbon and Macau, developed at the Center for Comparative Studies of the Università de Lisbona. Lots of languages in this bio, Daniela. In 2022, she joined the executive board of the International Group for Studies of the Colonial Periodical Press of the Portuguese Empire, while since 2018 she has been a member of the research group Thinking Goa at the Universidade de São Paulo. Her current research project deepens the study of post-colonial coming-of-age novels, specifically novels written by authors of the Indian Ocean region, intersecting the representation of colonial youth in post-colonial fiction with self-representations in periodicals edited by young agents during colonialism. And now I'll leave the floor to you with a presentation titled Narrated by the Water, Following Indian Ocean Currents to Conceive a Research Project on Colonial Youth. Over to you, Daniela. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Lucrezia. Thank you for the organizer of this wonderful seminar, and thank you for having me today. I have to say that my English sometimes fails, so I have to read my presentation, but everything is gonna be all right. Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yes. Can you go in?
Okay.
Perfect.
Okay. So I will begin my presentation by describing the role of water in my ongoing project on colonial youth and how water has been crucial in identifying my own research subject. Framing the research context in the Indian Ocean region, the project Narrating the Young, a comparative study on representation and self-representation of colonial youth in South Asia and East Africa that has just begun in October 2024, aims to compare post-colonial fiction depicting young characters growing up on the shores of the British and Portuguese empires with self-representation of youth in the press. More specifically, the project deepens the study of the post-colonial coming-of-age novel by intersecting the representation of youth in this literary genre with self-representation in periodicals edited by young agents and published during colonialism. In this way, the time-lapse 1930-1970 addresses two different chronological references, the year in which the novels are set and the year in which the periodicals were published. As you can see in the slide, there's no trace of water in the title of the project because the project is not focused on water issues. However, the connection between the different geographies involved in the project, as well as the transnational perspective through which literature is approached, was made possible by following the ocean currents. I began to think about how water shapes the context, not only the geopolitical features of the places in question, but above all, the context of each literary work, that is the construction of the text through the use of narratological categories such as time, space, and narrator. While the similarities and differences of the text allow for any comparison between life experiences transformed into fiction, as far as historical context is concerned, I take into account the imperial passages and the cultural influences to which the Indian Ocean communities were subjected during colonial rule, also considering how these passages changed shortly after the Bandung Conference of 1955 and the formation of the so-called non-aligned movement or third world. I've prepared some theoretical remarks to do, but I discovered just today that I have just 15 minutes, so I'm going directly to the core of my presentation.
It's quite all right. You can
Yeah.
you can go ahead with your 20-minute timing. It's our fault we've given conflicting information to different people, but 20 minutes is absolutely fine. Sorry. For
Okay. Thank you, Sam. Okay, here. So, as consolidated fields such as Indian Ocean Studies or recent epistemological terms such as blue humanities or oceanic humanities have come to prove, the critical corpus concerning theorizing on water literature is very prolific. In doing so, I will invoke just one of the concepts on which my analysis of the novels is based, the notion of hydrocolonialism, developed by Isabel Hofmeyr and further explored by Hofmeyr along with Charles Lavery and Sarah Nuttall in the essay Reading for Water. In this article, the three scholars define the exercise of reading for water as a method of analyzing literary fiction that takes into account the agentive power of water in literary text, and proposes new literary regions defined less by nation and area than by coastlines, river basins, monsoons, currents, and hydrocosmologies. Whether thinking along water courses, below the waterline, or through the fall of precipitation, reading for water moves laterally, vertically, contrapuntually between different water worlds and hydroimaginaries, end quotation. At the same time, as helping to identify literary regions that challenge interpretation of literature based on nation-state settings, the idea of reading for water contrapuntally allows for trans-imperial comparisons while ensuring a focus on the specificities of each colonial and post-colonial context. While the literary corpus of my research includes works by international established novelists such as Abdulrazak Gurna and Ramesh Gunisekera, today my paper will focus on two works written in Portuguese that are less familiar to international readers. These are the novel by the Goan writer Epitácio Paes, Prei-Amar, published in 2016, and the fictional memoir Pontagea by the Mozambican writer and historian João Paulo Borges Coelho. Both works are set in the late 1960s and early 1970s, although Epitácio Spy's story is set in a narrative-free Goa, while João Paulo Borges Coelho's book evokes memories of the last decades of colonial rule in Mozambique. Since the liberation struggle ended in 1961 in Portuguese India, while in Africa it was just beginning. So, despite the differences between the two political contexts, through the exercise of reading for water, we discover similarities in the way the two writers point to the agency of the ocean. Tides and floods mark the time of the narrative and interact with other characters, guiding them through dramatic political and cultural transition. So I'll start with the book Pontagea, published by Mozambican writer João Paulo Borges Coelho, whose literary works are often set in environments where water is the predominant natural element, like the two volumes that you can see in the slides, the two volumes of short stories Indicius Indicus, volume 1 and 2, where the water has an agentive and performative role, or the novel Agua, una novela rural, where the presence of water is marked by a participation in absentia, as the novel addresses the problem of river droughts. And I think the cover of the book is significant of this in absentia participation. So more than a coming-of-age novel, we could define Pontagea as a coming-of-age narrative in which the episodic nature of the plot allows us to read the book as a collection of short stories. Based on the memories of the author's childhood and adolescence in the homonymous neighborhood of Pontagea in the city of Beira, the largest town of Mozambique's central coast, the book follows the upheavals of a child growing up in the context of a community influenced by the tides of the ocean and affected by regular periods of flooding, as the country finds itself in the middle of the colonial war against Portugal, which lasted in Mozambique from 1964 to 1974. Water has an impact on the very structure of the book, which is made up of chapters that are disconnected from each other, resembling an archipelago. This insular writing intention is made explicit by the author in the preambular note that precedes the narration. And now allow me to quote in Portuguese while you can read the translation is in the slide, okay? Nada liga os episódios entre si, a não ser o encadeamento sugerido por desígnios que conosco transportamos, clandestinamente embarcados. Na verdade, ao contrário da rigidez das estradas, o mar deixa em aberto todos os roteiros. A criação de uma rota constitui ao mesmo tempo a morte de todas as outras. E esse o sentido da viagem. First of all, we note the metaphorical meaning of the sea voyage associated with the transformation of the young into an adult, as well as the loss of innocence, a literary topic that we find revisited in different literary works from around the world, like in a classical such as Lord Jim by Joseph Konrad, but also all the narratives around indentured laborers and the coolies and Kalapani Taboo, like the Ibis trilogy of Amitav Ghosh. Still in the preamble, it can be seen that the imagetic power of the sea is linked to the construction of the text, claiming for a narrative line that is fluid, open to many possibilities, unlike the linearity of the teleological narration of the European coming-of-age novel. In this regard, the language employed by the author recalls maritime vocabulary and refers to the uncertainty of the events, but also to the fragility of dreams and plans drawn up during the youth, as we read in the phrase, designs that we carry with us, clandestinely embarked. From an aesthetic point of view, the importance of water in this book stands out above all in the first chapter, Cidade Líquida, Liquid City, in which the narrator outlines the watery space, and in the fourth chapter, Mangal, that means mangrove forest, where the literary topic of the initiation journey is represented by an excursion into a mangrove forest made of mud and water. In the chapter Cidade Líquida, Liquid City, water shapes not only the natural landscape of Pontagea, but also the built environment and human life itself, restricting the way in which the residents of the neighborhood relate to each other. As we can read in the first paragraph, the water is described with different adjectives that either praise its calmness or its devastating force. You can follow the translation in the slide. É a primeira e mais persistente lembrança, a água como substância da cidade, uma água quieta, insidiosa, avassaladora, uma água cálida onde nadam todos, aqueles de cujo rastro ainda as passos me vou apercebendo, e os outros, os que vogam em círculos como peixes aprisionados no aquário do esquecimento. In this way, the memories are visually transposed onto the writing as blurred images, which prevents the narrator from having a clear view of his past, a concept reinforced by the idea of the fish swimming in the aquarium of oblivion. However, the water of Pontagea is not only the water of the sea, but also the rain that floods the neighborhood and fills the mangrove swamp, turning into the origin of all things. And for Tenon, we read chove sem parar here, and I'm here, it rains on and on. Chove sem parar, chove até a noite, e durante a noite no dia seguinte, e todos os dias, até o mangal ser o mar, e tudo que era duro e firme se acabar. So, until the mangrove forest is the sea, and everything that was hard and firm is gone. While Pontagea's community prepares to watch this great shipwreck on dry land and lose their homes, the storm and the violent swell of the sea increase the transformative power of the water, which also affects the colonial power, which from hard and firm becomes inert in the eyes of the children, represented by the image of the policemen who retreat into their homes, waiting for the great waves, the wave. Again, original source text and translation. Todavia, de nada lhe servem hoje as pistolas e os cacetetes, de nada lhe serve habitual irascibilidade nesta guerra com as ondas. O mar é surdo a todo tipo de ameaças e apelos. Segue o quadro aqui apresentado, obstinado na sua fúria e naquilo que reclama. Hoje exige as casas dos polícias. E nós somos pequenas testemunhas intrigadas com a inédita fraqueza da autoridade, a inédita fúria do mar que conhecemos de todos os dias, mais dócil e mais manso. Por vezes resmungal, mas nunca assim desta maneira. The flood is filtered through the eyes of the narrator and the other children who watch with childlike fascination the fury of nature on Praia dos Pinheiros, but also as passionate little witnesses to the failure of power, as they point out the impotence of police action in trying to evict people from their house. A partir de certa altura, os compounds não passavam, como disse, de ruínas que nunca tiveram gente, nem polícias, nem outros quaisquer, apenas um mero refúgio de deserdados e vagabundos com os seus gestos clandestinos, por vezes desalojados pelos polícias, com uma raiva, por uma vez justificada. So, with a rage that was justified for once, where for once refers to a perception of the violence as a part of the everyday life of the neighborhood. I'm going to switch now to Praia Mar. Albeit in a different way, the topic of the loss of innocence is also addressed by Epitas Supais in his novel Praia Mar, whose title means high tide. Written in Portuguese and published posthumously in 2016, Praia Mar recounts the return of a young man, Leo, to his hometown Baga, a quiet little seaside village transformed by the arrival of the hippies in Goa, which takes place in the 70s, just after the fall of the Portuguese colonial rule. The novel highlights the difficulties of coping with the social changes brought about by the end of colonialism, but also the cultural challenges posed by young travelers from all over the West, including the loss of sexual mores, the emancipation of women, and economic globalization. The arrival of the hippies upsets the collective moral, involving a different occupation of the maritime space and the subtraction of this space from those who make their livelihood from the sea. As in the case of the girls of the sea, the raparigas do mar, who are the young fish sellers who feel intimidated by the presence of naked men and women on the beach. So going to the beach and accessing the water is therefore dependent on meeting the other, which implies an effective loss of innocence for these women. In this sense, in the novel, the sea becomes a contested territory, the theater of a cultural clash where the actors in question dispute not only the occupation of a physical space, but also their own view of the world. Unlike the narrator of Pontagea, the main characters of Priamar are neither children nor teenagers. They are young men and women in their 25s, more or less. So nevertheless, they fall within the idea of colonial youth for having been brought up in colonial times, hence for having been influenced by a conservative Catholic culture. Characters like Leo and Bento defy Catholic morality by having sexual relations with foreign women and ultimately, as in Leo's case, by deciding to marry a girl from a lower caste. However, it is the character of Bento who most represents the idea of loss of innocence, which is related to the deterioration of his relationship with the watery space. Bento is a young fisherman, Amy's brother, who begins to get along with the hippies, adopting their habits, including consumption of alcohol and heroin, neglecting fishery, and as explained in the dialogue that you can between Leo and Bento's sister Amy. So translation is on the right side. Agora o contrário, leva a vida de ocioso, não se importa com o barco, com as redes, nada. Vendo em companhia do Simon e outros sentados numa roda a fumar um cachimbo. Volta para casa fora de horas. Afirma que vai casar com a Christine. Quem é a Christine? A Christine é uma do grupo do Simon. Aparece nua na praia, estendida na areia, a banhar-se e a tornar a deitar ao sol. Olhe, Amy, deixe-o casar com a Christine, disse para tranquilizar. Fará sua própria desgraça a nossa. Eles são tão diferentes da nossa gente, não se adaptam à nossa maneira de viver. The configuration of the beach and the sea as contested territory emerges very clearly in the dialogue between Leo and Amy, as does the idea of worlds in opposition, with any reconciliation seemingly impossible, with the family's livelihood at stake. Bento's sister, Amy, used to trade the fisher her brother caught, but now he offers them to the hippies in exchange for drugs, jeopardizing the whole family business. The change in the relationship between the character of Bento and the sea becomes even more evident at his funeral. The narrator describes how the visions of Bento's dead body triggers memories of his joyful youth in Leo, once again emphasizing the idea of the loss of innocence. Here, I cannot move. Okay. Quando Leo viu no caixão, imaginou aquele corpo 5 anos mais velho. 5 anos mais velho do que ele, cheio de vida, andando em sua companhia, às ameijas na praia e sapateiras nas rochas, dando-lhe as primeiras lições de natação na ansiada de baga, subindo e descendo em evoluções perigosas, os casuais em busca de ninhos de bulbul e frutos silvestres. As in Pontagea, also in Priamar, this is not the only form in which water appears, as the monsoon rain also marks the rhythms of the narrative. Although it is difficult for the fishermen to sail out during the monsoon, it represents a moment of respite for Baga's community, who once again have access to the water while the hippies move to the north of India. Water is also the element that marks the distinction between the Hindu space and the Goan Catholic space, as can we read in the stories told by the hippies when they return to Goa in winter. They speak of the sacredness of the places they visit in North India and the respect shown by bathing in the waters of the sacred rivers, thus creating in the text a kind of antithetical comparison that emphasizes the profanity of the sea as a space of last transgression compared to the river as a sacred water. To conclude, and by the way of comparison, water not only plays a part in the construction of the setting of the two novels, well of the two. I lost. To conclude, and by way of comparison, water not only plays a part in the construction of the sector of the two novels, but also regulates the rhythm of the narration through waves and tides, as well as floods and rains. In the case of Preia Mare by Pitasio Pais, the oscillation of the tides follows the wanderings of Leo's character, who walks along the beach in search of opportunities to escape the boredom of the social obligations that come with becoming an adult. Moreover, the monsoon governs the outcome of events, creating a cycle of occurrences prone to repetition, such as the interruption of fishing activities and the exodus of the hippies when the summertime comes. On the contrary, in Pontagea, the sea doesn't imprint the consequential stages of the young narrator's life, but as the author himself explained in the preamble, the sea leaves all hypotheses open, emphasizing the different paths that individuals can take as they grow up. In this sense, water has its own performative agency in the plots of the novels. Water shapes the literary context, generating fictional worlds that shed light on the education of young people in a context of colonial domination and its impact on the formation of post-colonial society. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Daniela. That was so brilliant. I love to hear the Portuguese quotes as well. Thank you so much. Big applause to you.
Thank you.